Robert Harris will be providing the exhortation this morning, and his title is In God We Trust. And he has asked that we read in connection with his thoughts 1 Samuel 17, 8 through 16. 1 Samuel 17, 8 through 16. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you the man for you, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me, and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that Ephraite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons. And the man went among the men of the old, for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to battle. And the names of the 3 sons that went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shema. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistines drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. So let's give our attention now to our brother Robert Harris on the subject, In God We Trust.
Good morning. We're all familiar with the inscription on our coins, In God We Trust. Maybe so much so that it's a little bit too familiar to us, and maybe we don't understand what that really means. Do we really trust God? Or is it just an inscription that takes up space on one side of our coins? You know, we can know God, but do we trust him? We can be familiar with God and his word, but do we trust him? And we see that that was really the story behind David and Goliath, one of the stories that we've learned from our youngest of years, maybe the first story that we hear and that we learn as children. But I'd like to approach this from a little bit a different perspective this morning, and kind of also take into account the life that we live now in this day and age. Well, the army of Israel, of the Israelites, were terrified of this giant, and we probably would be too. But they were terrified to the point where they had lost their trust in God. For in front of them was a giant, one with a boisterous voice, one that seemed undefeatable by conventional wisdom. And so for 40 days, this giant comes out and defies the armies of Israel. And each day that fear that the army of God became greater and greater. They would run, literally run, when he challenged them. And they had convinced themselves that they could not overcome the challenge. Goliath hadn't defeated him. They had defeated themselves. And I think that's really a lesson for us, is that a lot of times the challenges we face, the challenge doesn't defeat us, but our own minds, our own thoughts we defeat ourselves. You can imagine around the evening circle of dinner around the camp with the army. You can imagine the talk every day for 40 days. Talk about Goliath's size. Did you see the armor he's wearing? Did you see how tall he is? Did you see his shield? Did you see his sword? And the certainty of being defeated by him became greater and greater, rather than the certainty of the power of God. Fear gripped them completely, to the point when each day when he came out and challenged them, they ran. All the while, during this 40 days, this giant became larger and larger, and the power of God became smaller and smaller, to the point of maybe even being diminished entirely. Well, for 40 days, this scene repeated itself. Now, it's important to note that the army of the Israelites heard this every day and was around the conversation every day as this giant of a man challenged the army of Israel. David was not part of this daily routine. The Israelites had defeated themselves, but David hadn't. David hadn't been part of that month-long routine of hearing this giant's boisterous voice and the seeing running of the army. And you can imagine Goliath's humor, his knowing that he had gotten under their skin, and he created such a fear that they would run. So Goliath probably looked at, as the story unfolds, David is not being really a serious foe. But David saw Goliath's challenge a little bit differently. David saw this challenge not as the army of Israel did, a man that was a giant, a man that could not be defeated. David hadn't spent time around the campfires or the social media of the day, where each day and night, hearing the negative talk about how Goliath could not be defeated, how his appearance was overwhelming, and how the diminishment of God's power became less and less every day. David hadn't been defeated by the negative talk of others around him, and he hadn't been defeated by the fear that had crippled the army of the living God. Fear is crippling, whether it's a foe in front of us or perceived foe that we can't see. Fear can cripple someone or a group of people, especially if there is talk within a group that is ungodly or does not trust fully in God. In David's short life, he had felt God's presence in overcoming impossible challenges. He was just a shepherd. David was just a shepherd. I mean, he was small in stature. He was evidently a very handsome young man, but he wasn't a big guy, especially compared to Goliath. But in David's short life, he had overcome many beasts, and he saw Goliath as another beast. He had overcome a bear. He had overcome a lion. And on each occasion, he had defeated the beast that threatens his family's flock. He didn't take his own life into account when he saw the sheep in the mouth of a lion or a bear. He just went and took care of the situation and slew each. And he was certain that he could defeat this beast of a giant as well. David didn't hesitate when he came back after 40 days and saw what was going on. he didn't hesitate. He saw Goliath as no greater a foe than the lion or the bear that was endangering his flock. God had prepared David for this moment. I think I've talked along these lines before, but God did not send David into this situation ill-equipped. Now, he came ill-equipped as far as armor was concerned, or conventional wisdom of the day on you need a shield, and you need armor, and you need a spear, and you need all of these weapons. God prepared him differently. He prepared him by being a shepherd, by challenging that bear, challenging the lion. Well, we'll pick up the story in 1 Samuel 17, verse 20. Now, David had not been around the camp for 40 days. He goes to the camp to take supplies and food for his brothers that his father had sent him. And we'll pick up in verse 20. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd. That was his normal job. Loaded up and set out, as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. And David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. So we see this had become a usual scene for all of this army of Israel. They had convinced themselves that the only answer to this giant was to run. And you can imagine this young man with not any armor or anything, that has not been familiar with this scene unfolding for 40 days, and sees this. What thought goes through his mind? Was he gripped with fear as well, just like the rest of the army? We can see God's hand, his timing, and his purpose in this story. Why did God not send David a month earlier, before all of this took place, before all of this fear just infested the thoughts of the army? Well, the answer is that God wanted to show his power, displayed through a young man, seemingly ill-prepared and totally impossible for him to defeat this foe, at least by conventional wisdom and conventional powers. But God had prepared him by his hand, by the experiences that David had seen and had lived up to this point. In verse 32, we'll look over to that. And David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." So this challenge that had defeated this entire army of Israel, with all of their spears, shields, armor, you name it, they had run. But David, probably the smallest of the group, the smallest one there, says to Saul, "Let's not lose heart on account of this Philistine. I, your servant, will go and fight him." Well, through the course of this time, Saul had become defeated as well, defeated in his mind. For we see the answer of Saul in verse 33. "You're not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been a keeper of his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from a flock, I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be just like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So we see this skilled warrior, the king of Israel. He and his army defeated. But David, a young man, a shepherd, comes into the camp after over a month and says, I'll defeat this giant. I'll defeat this foe. And Saul, being defeated as well, says, no, you can't, David, and tries to dissuade him. But David doesn't take no for an answer. He explains to him how God has equipped him for this moment. But what did Saul do? He told him, go, may the Lord be with you. But he also did something else. Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. Can you imagine a small man? Probably the armor was made for somebody much larger than he was. David putting it all on, then he tries to walk around. It's probably kind of humorous to maybe David's brothers, who's like, what does David think he's doing? He's a shepherd. He's unprepared for this, and maybe a little fearful as well. But David says, excuse me, I cannot use these. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from a stream, put them in a pouch, his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. So you can imagine the fear that the armies of the living God saw as they saw this young shepherd boy, confident that he could defeat this foe, putting on this armor that didn't fit, and seeing him try to walk around. There was probably a little bit of laughter maybe in the camp, seeing this sight. But David throws it off and says, I can't use this. It doesn't fit. I'm not used to it. So he goes and picks up 5 stones. Quite a sight. This is a giant that he's going to face. This is a man that the whole army of Israel had run from for 40 days. But David goes and chooses 5 stones, a sling and a pouch. Goliath saw the humor in it as well. For we see in verse 45, David said to the Philistine, actually, I jumped ahead. Meanwhile, verse 41, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was a little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you would come with me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. But David said to the Philistine, you come against me with the sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcass of the Philistine army to the birds of the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. A young shepherd with a confident attitude, not in himself, but a confidence of God, stands up to this giant. resolute in defeating this foe. Well, this is a story that we have heard for generations, and in fact, our whole lifetime. But what is the lesson for today? What's the lesson in our day and age? We don't have armies of shields and spears and armor such as maybe modern warfare, but what is the lesson for us as spiritual people? Because we can become bombarded by the conventional wisdom of the day, just as the Israeli army had, the army of the Israelites had been defeated by their own wisdom, the conventional wisdom that they thought what they could use to defeat this giant. And every day for 40 days, this continual talk of this giant, this foe, became greater and greater, and the power of God was diminished. And we too can allow the mindset of our times to become a giant in our lives as well. We can allow the mindset of our current age to permeate our thoughts and grow like a silent cancer that destroys our spirit and trust in God. See, that's the whole difference in David and the rest of the army. He had not lost his trust in God. He had not been around that social media of the day or that news of the day that we are bombarded with daily. For God had removed him from that. So when the armies of God had defeated themselves, David comes on the scene and really brings life not only into himself through trusting God, but also this whole army that had been defeated. Can you imagine, as he challenges this foe, how the armies, these individual soldiers, felt as they saw this resolute trust in God, how that infected the whole group. So we think that we as one individual can't do much, but yet look what David did. And the culmination was the slaying of the giant. How do we overcome this beast in our current times? Well, we need to remember how God has worked in our lives and is working in our lives to teach us, to show us his love and care. We all face challenges, all of us, very different. But nonetheless, there are challenges that can defeat us if we allow it, especially in the most difficult of circumstances, if we're thinking in worldly terms or things that we understand. But God had to prepare David differently. He had prepared him in such a way that he was sitting in a field alone as a shepherd, a boy. But yet he had challenged him to trust him when the lion and the bear were endangering his flock. We need to recognize it is God's hand that saves us and not our own. You see, the army of Israel felt like they were the ones that were being challenged and not God. And it was by their hands that they would deliver this foe, and thus they were defeated. David knew that God was the one that had delivered him from the wild beasts, and not by his own hands. He didn't go boasting, look what I did. I slew this bear, I slew this lion. For he knew that God, it was through the power of God working through him that he was able to slay these beasts. And he knew that that same power would flow through him to defeat this giant. It's important that we recognize that God is in our success. And he's also in our failures, and the lessons that we learn in our failures. You know, sometimes we win and sometimes we learn. so it said. And sometimes, most of the time, we learn more from our failures than we do in our success. Now, when you're fighting a lion and you're fighting a bear, you can't fail. Or David would not have been on the scene to defeat this giant. But God prepared him in such a way that David, the small young man, a teenager, was able to face this giant. We also need to limit the chatter of the day. You know, much as the camp was around the campfire or while they were eating, you know, convincing themselves that they could not defeat this giant, to the point where they ran every day when he challenged them. And that giant today can be any type of media or outside influence that challenges our trust in God. If that consumes us and our thoughts, we will run just as the Israelite army did. It's good that we are aware of our times and what's going on, but not to the point where it consumes our thoughts. We need to be like David and remember, think about that first time that he slew that lion or that bear. Once that adrenaline had subsided and he saw this beast that should have killed him, but yet David killed him instead. What was that like? It's probably like, thank you, God. I thank you for helping me. I realize what you've done for me, but for my family. And so when he meets the next beast, it repeats itself. So it's not a fluke. God is with him. So when he sees this beast of a giant, he's confident as he can be that God is with him. We too should have that same confidence in our lives that God is with us. Through success, but especially in defeat, in failure. Let it not defeat our minds, for God too works with us. And after this event, we know that David had both times of spiritual strength in his life, but also time of weakness. So our faith can ebb and flow. We can have times where we have the ultimate trust in God, but we can see where the world and our thoughts can get the best of us, and we can act in such a ways that does not glorify God. You know, there's another example of God working in Moses' life. But Moses questioned God and his calling. David didn't question God when challenged by the giant, but we see that God too was working in Moses' life. Let's turn now over to Exodus 3. We'll read verses 7 through 11. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I'm come down to rescue them from the land of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way of the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. You can imagine Moses, who was living a comfortable life, who had gotten used to this land out of being out of Egypt. And one day he hears this voice of God, this angel of God telling him, go to Egypt. You're going to be the instrument that I use for my purpose. But Moses can only see his inadequacies. He doesn't see the power of God. He only sees who he is. And he's a very humble man, and that's certainly admirable. But he was humble to the point where he only saw his imperfections, only saw the things that he felt like God could not use. But just as God had prepared David for his calling, he prepared Moses as well. And it's also interesting to note that God was very patient with Moses in working through all of the things that he had to go through in seeing his weaknesses, in seeing his inadequacies. God was very patient with him in working through all of this. But the Lord patiently works with him to convince him that he, not Moses, would deliver the Israelites. And Moses would be the instrument through whom God worked. Let's look at Exodus 14 and pick it up at Exodus 4. And we'll look at verses 6 through 13. Then the Lord said, "Put your hand inside your cloak." So Moses put his hand inside his cloak. We took it out. The skin was leprous. It had become white as snow. But put it back in your cloak, he said. So Moses put his hand back in his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored, like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, "If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground." After all of this conversation, Moses says, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I'm slow in speech and tongue." And then God works with him more. And then in verse 13, Moses says, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." Moses had defeated himself while being called by the angel of God. But through patience, God works with Moses and lets him know that, "Moses, you are the man that I'm sending, and I will equip you in every way to do what I ask." What's our lesson? We need to remember that the Lord is working in our lives as well. He didn't just work in David's life. He didn't just work in Moses' life. He didn't work in just the people found in this book. He works in our lives as well. They had human failings, just as you and I. They had weaknesses, just like you and I. They had failings, just like you and I. But God continued to work with them, and he continues to work with us to shape us into useful vessels. We can't look at ourselves from conventional ways. We need to look at ourselves as being created by God, instruments of God through whom he can work. Isaiah says, "We are the clay, and God is the potter." He shapes us and molds us in ways that he can use. And in Psalm 100, we read, "It's not we that have made ourselves, but God. It is he who has made us, and not we ourselves." The Lord worked with Moses, and he didn't realize it. God is working with us as well, and we often don't realize it. But it's important that we wake up to this challenges that we face in our personal lives. Some are greater than we'd ever think possible to overcome. But God is with us. Moses was comfortable where he was when he was called, but he was not comfortable with who he was. But God can use us anyway. He will mold us and shape us into useful vessels. You know, Moses only saw human limitations, but God sees something more. God sees us as one of his children, one that he wants success. He doesn't want us to fail. He wants success. And we likewise should give him that opportunity to work with us so that we can learn from our failures and ultimately succeed. But we don't do it alone. We do it together. For we see that through negative talk, negative ways, it can infest an entire group. But it just as with one person thinking in godly ways, it can also uplift a whole group. Let us uplift one another in our ecclesias, in our personal lives, in our families, always trying to find the best in others. And this is what I'm saying to myself, to always find the best in others, to see each person as an instrument of God, to help us individually along the way to overcome the challenges that we faced. But the biggest challenge of all, the biggest limitation of all, is our own mindset. It's not outside influences, it's what's in our minds. Let's work with that to understand that God made us in such a way that we can overcome anything that he allows us to, and not be limited by our mindsets. But let us be filled with God's word, his plan, his ways, and allow him to work in us and others as well as we walk together towards his kingdom. We'll finish by reading Micah 6:8. It's a familiar passage for all of us. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Let us do this individually and collectively until he returns. Thank you.